It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Have the opportunity to study the Bible together. Son Wilson has been here in meetings, I think, a time or so, and I won't hold that against you. He's told me a lot of good things about you, and I look forward to spending the day with you and studying the Bible. I want to talk to you this morning about some of the one another passages in the New Testament. There are too many of them to study all of them, but I want to select 3 or 4 as the time will allow and talk to you about that. You know, when you became a Christian, you entered into a very special relationship with God, but you also entered into a special relationship with the people of God. We have responsibilities to one another in our special relationship with God. And so let's get right to work on it. In John chapter 13, verses 34 and 5, Jesus said, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another. As I have loved you, even so," he said, "love one another, and by this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." Now, when Jesus said, "A new commandment I give unto you," we're not to understand from that love had not been taught before. In fact, in the book of Matthew, chapter 22, they came to Jesus one time and said, "What is the first and great commandment in the law?" They thought he'd single out maybe one of the 10 commandments. And Jesus said, "The first commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. And the second," he said, "is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So love was not a new thing to be taught when Jesus came. Well, why did he say, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another," if love had been taught before? Well, he qualifies that. He said, "As I have loved you." Now, I want to tell you there never has been a demonstration of love such as was manifested by the Son of God when he came. And if you don't think that's so, you just read the accounts of the trials and crucifixion of our Lord, and all that he endured for us, that we might be his children and that we might be saved. That's a special kind of love. I just got through reading this morning while I was waiting for Martin to get ready. I finished reading the book of Matthew. Chapters 26 and 7 are hard for me to read even and maintain my composure. I preached a good while, but it's hard for me in preaching just to read those passages and see what our Lord did for us, what he suffered for us, so we might be saved. So when Jesus said, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another," he said, "even as I have loved you." Then he said one time, "What greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." In Romans, the 5th chapter, verses 8 and 9, Paul talked there about the love which the Lord had for us, and that when we were yet sinners, Christ died for the ungodly. So, that's one another passage number 1 today. What shall we do? We shall love one another as he loved us. And by that, the world will know that we're his disciples if we love one another. Now, if we don't treat each other right, the world is liable not to catch on that we're his disciples at all. So that places a special responsibility on us in our relationship one to another. Let's change the subject. Let's go to Galatians 6 and verse 2. Paul said, "Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Bear one another's burdens. Now down in verse 5 of that chapter, he said, let every man bear his own burden. We have a conflict here, you suppose? One passage says, bear one another's burdens, and another one says, let every man bear his own burden. Well, there are some responsibilities that we have in life that we can't trade to anybody else. That's something we have to take care of. That's our duty. In fact, in 1 Timothy 5, Timothy said, if a man provide not for his own, he is worse than an infidel or an unbeliever. He's denied the faith if he doesn't take care of his own. I can't trade that responsibility off to you. You have responsibilities in that regard at your house, and you can't trade that off to me either. These are our personal responsibilities. But now there are some burdens that people have in life that we can share with each other. Have you ever visited folks in a nursing home? I've done that many times. And you see people that seldom have any company. Sometimes they're sitting in wheelchairs out in the hallway, and you walk by them, and they try to start a conversation with you. They're just hungry for somebody to simply acknowledge their existence. If you could spend a little time with folks like that, and don't keep looking at your watch like you're being imposed upon to be there with them. You're in an awful hurry, get this over with and get out. No. You have people that are shut-ins at home. They're Christians that can't get out and get about like they once did. And you can spend a little time with them, just listening to them, talking to them. They're hungry for that. And if you can do that you're bearing one another's burdens. We have people that have to go to the doctor and they can't drive anymore. Can you? Could you take them to that doctor's appointment? Maybe they have a prescription to fill and they can't get to the pharmacy. Can you do that for them? It may even be that they need some things from the grocery store and they're not able to go. Now, I know you can call the grocery stores now. Some of them will deliver groceries to your house, and that's a help, all right. But there are so many things that we can do to help one another with the burdens that we bear. Sometimes there are families that have tragedies to strike. Death comes and takes our loved ones away. And they need to be comforted. Can you say just a few words of comfort? You know, I've been to a lot of funeral homes when there's a death, and I never have known what to say. I still don't know. But I decided after people coming to the funeral home when it was my turn to grieve, that it didn't matter what they said. The fact that they came and shook my hand or embraced me at that critical time spoke volumes about the fact that they cared. I want to tell you, that's bearing one another's burdens and fulfilling the law of Christ. Bear one another's burdens. Now let's change the subject again. In Romans, the 15th chapter, in verse 7, Paul said that we are to receive one another. Now, we need to do a little homework, a little work here about the background of that statement. This is the climax of the argument that Paul makes in Romans chapter 14 when he talks about issues that have to do with private convictions, private scruples that we don't always agree on. And there were two particular instances of that he dealt with. One of them had to do with the eating of meat. Now, this was a problem for Gentiles and Jews alike. They weren't. It wasn't the same problem for them, but they both shared problems about that. There were certain things that were forbidden to the Jew under the law of Moses. The Gentile didn't have that problem. Now let's pose a scenario here and think about it. Here's a brother who's a Jew now, and he's been converted to the Lord. And he's invited to the home of a Gentile Christian. And he's glad to receive that invitation. He wants to fit in, be a part. So he goes. And guess what they have? They have pork chops. Pork chops. He's a Jew. He's never had a bite of pork chop in his mouth before. And he's not really sure he can do this. So his Gentile host sees that he's uncomfortable, and he lectures him about it a little bit. He says, now listen, the law has been nailed to the cross. And those restrictions about meat, they don't apply anymore. And it's perfectly all right, and it tastes good, and you'll enjoy it. Well, he doesn't want to be ungrateful and to the hospitality offered to him. So he takes one on his plate and cuts him off a little piece of it and tries to chew it. And the more he chews it, the bigger it gets, and he's not even sure he can swallow it. Now, Paul said we are to receive one another. If a brother has a problem with that, he needs to be taught, all right. Can they discuss it? Yes, he needs to be taught. He can never be a strong Christian without being taught. But he doesn't need to have something crammed down his throat before he has time to grow and learn. And so the stronger brother realizes that it's just meat, and it is. Is it all right with God to eat it? Yes. But this brother's got a little problem. He never has done this before. He's got to have time to grow and to learn. So the strong brother is to bear with the weak brother and give him time to learn, give him time to grow. So that's what Paul meant when he said, receive one another. Now there was another issue that was a vital issue in the early church. And that had to do with the observance of days. The law of Moses, under the law of Moses, they observed the Sabbath. They weren't to work on the Sabbath day. And there were feast days that they kept. And these were special days. They didn't work on these days either. And they were days when they did certain things, and they meant to do it in honor of the Lord. Now, when they became a Christian, the Sabbath is no longer binding. These feast days are no longer binding either. Now, let's suppose another scenario here. Here's a brother out of a Jewish background, and he becomes a Christian. And here's a brother that his barn is burned down, and he's having a barn raising at his place on Saturday. And some of the brethren are going to come over there and help him build a new barn. And they invite him to come. Get your saw and your hammer and come on, help us. Well, he's honored to be asked to be a part of this. He doesn't want to be different. So he takes his saw and his hammer and other things that he thinks he'll need, and he goes. But it's Saturday. And he never worked on Saturday. And every time he drives a nail, it kills his conscience. Conscience is hurting. But he doesn't want to be different. He doesn't want to be left out. And because a brother says to him, now listen, the law of Moses is nailed to the cross. We're not under that anymore. And it's all right to work on a Saturday. It's okay. And so he over-persuades him. And that brother, he does the best he can to get along with it, but his conscience hurts him the whole time he's doing this. And the strong brother ought not to bind his will upon this weak brother in this regard. It's all right to teach him, yes. Can't ever move from being a weak brother to being a strong brother without being taught. He has to learn. But the point is, he has to have time to learn. And he has to have time to grow. And so the lesson is that we need to be patient with one another and give each other time to sort these things out in their own consciences. That's what Paul meant when he said, receive one another. We all have scruples about different things. It depends on our raising. My father wouldn't let us have playing cards in the house. I don't have any at my house. I have some Brook cards, but I don't have the regular playing cards at my house. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, playing games with it. But my father wouldn't let us have them because he thought these were the tools of gamblers. And he didn't want us to learn about gambling at our house. So we didn't have any. That was a scruple of his. He did try to bind that on everybody else, but that was a conviction of his. I remember it well. All of us have grown up with certain things that are off limits to us from our training, our parents. And so, but we're not all tuned into the same wavelength on that either. We don't all have the same scruples. And so we've got to learn to get along with each other. We've got to live together. And we've got to worship together. And we have to learn together. Like Jesus said, we need to learn to love together. Love one another as I've loved you. But that lesson in Romans 15:7, this is the climax of this whole argument about the strong and the weak brother. So the weak brother has responsibilities too. He ought not to put the strong brother in his lockbox, because he needs to respect him. But we need to tolerate one another. We need to forbear with one another, the Bible teaches. So, receive one another. Now let's change the subject again. Let's go this time to the book of Hebrews, 13th chapter, and let's go this time to the verse where Paul said, verse 9, that we are to show hospitality to one another without grudging. What does that mean? Hospitality. One of the qualifications of an elder is he's to be given to hospitality. That's to be a part of his makeup. He's to be free-handed, open-handed, ready to receive guests and to do whatever he can to make them comfortable. I wonder whatever happened to hospitality. Do you know? There was a time when people visited each other. You just load up in the car and go to somebody's house and knock on the door. Well, did they call first? No, because they didn't have a telephone. The people they're visiting didn't have one either. They just showed up. I can remember as a boy in Virginia, southeastern Virginia, when we could look down through the cornfield and see car lights coming. That meant one thing: we're going to have company, because there wasn't anywhere else for that car to come except our house. That's all that was up that road. And my mother would say, "We've got company coming. You kids pick up." That meant straighten the house up a little bit. We got company. And they'd come. And I was always glad when I was a boy to see company come, because that meant we were going to have entertainment that night. The old folks would talk, and the kids would sit on the floor with big eyes and big ears and listen. You didn't butt in either. Sometimes my daddy would say to my mother, "Hon, could you go in the kitchen and fix us a little fudge? Make a little candy." It was a good time. When company came. Whatever happened to that, you suppose? Well, several things happened to it. People got a little more money. They became more mobile. More people had cars to get out of the house and go somewhere. And then television came along. Television. Everybody didn't have one at first. And if you didn't have one, if you visited somebody who had one, you had to learn the new rules of the house. You did not talk during the program. You only talked during the commercials, because you didn't want to miss any of the program. That changed a lot of things. And people got busier. We had conveniences that came on the market supposedly to help us save time. What they did in many cases was to clutter up our lives with gadgets. And some of them didn't save time. But be that as it may, a number of things have interfered with hospitality. If it had not been for hospitality at our house, I probably would not be standing here in front of you as a preacher today. When I was about 14, we had a gospel meeting coming up. And one night there was a business meeting, one of those short meetings, wouldn't take very long, so we waited a long time in the car. My dad came out, and my mother said, "That's kind of a long meeting." He said, "Yeah. There's a preacher coming, his name was, and this was actually his name, Bon Stocks. He was a good fellow, good preacher. He was an interesting man. He had gone to Washington, D.C. as a secretary for Senator J.C. Rankin from the state of Mississippi. And so he worked for the government. He'd met a lot of important people. And that made my mother nervous. He'd even met Franklin D. Roosevelt. And so she was awed by that. My dad said, the reason we had such a long meeting, said, it looked like didn't anybody want to keep the man. My mother said, "Well, who is going to keep him?" My dad said, "We are." My mother said, "We are? We don't even have a bathroom in the house." We didn't. Don't have running water in the house. We didn't. She said, "I don't have enough dishes that match to even set a good table." My dad, men are problem solvers. You know that, ladies? Men are problem solvers. My dad didn't see what the problem was. He said, "Well, we live this way all the time. Surely he can survive a week on it." It was a 10-day meeting, by the way. Well, he'd already volunteered. My mother couldn't get out of that. So she borrowed some dishes from her sisters. They had lots of dishes, and so she borrowed some. They painted the room where he was to stay before he got there. And special preparations were made. He came. We were enamored with this visitor in our home. He knew a lot. He had been a lot of places, met a lot of people, and we were intrigued with listening to him tell about places he'd been, places he'd preached. It got to the place that he was invited a lot to preach around Washington, and he was so good at it that the brethren persuaded him to give up his job with the government and just preach. And he did that the rest of his life. One day he said to me, I don't know why he did this, But he called me Cornelius. And that is not my name. Don't you call me that. But he did. One day he said, Cornelius, said, I got to go to town to get my car serviced. Said, how about riding over to town with me? I said, okay. I was 14 years old. You know, boys want to ride in somebody else's car. So on the way to town, he asked me a question that turned my whole world upside down, and I haven't got it straightened out yet. He said, Cornelius, what are you going to do when you grow up? I said, well, my brother Wiley and I are going to go to Nashville, Tennessee and play on the Grand Ole Opry. We had a band. My brother was older than I was, but I was a part of that band. We played on the radio, did stage shows for people around. And I just knew that when we got to Nashville and they found out we were in town, they'd welcome us right to the stage of the Grand Ole Opry. I was a little bit naive as a kid, but that was our dream. That was our ambition, to do that. He said, well, that sounds like fun. But did you ever think about being a gospel preacher? I said, no, sir. I don't think I could do that. I wouldn't know what to say. He said, does it make you nervous to get up and play and sing in front of people? And I said, no, I kind of like it. My wife said, not just a ham, I'm pure pork. He said, see there? You have stage fright whipped already. You don't have to worry about stage fright. It didn't bother me to get up in front of people. Well, he didn't say any more till we started back to the house. And on the way back to the house, he said, you know, Cornelius, he said, I got some notes I've typed up about the history of the church and how all the different churches got started. And he said, I worked hard on that. And he said, I've got a number of pages of it, but he said, while I'm here, if you'd like to, you can copy those, because you don't ever know, one day you might be able to use those. I still have them. I came home and rushed in and got some paper and something to write with, and started copying those notes. My mother said, what are you doing? I said, Brother Stock's got some notes here about how all the churches started. And he said I could copy them. You know what? I didn't realize it at the time. But when he asked me that question, did you ever think about being a gospel preacher? That planted a seed in my heart. And I hadn't been able to get rid of it yet. When I was 15 years old, I preached my first sermon. And I'm thankful that somebody would sit and listen to me. I still am. But you know where that all started? That started with a father who believed in hospitality. We didn't have a lot that other people had, but he was willing to share it with a visiting preacher. And I don't know how many times I've been in a home where there's a little 12 or 13-year-old boy, and I said to them, I hope I get to hear you preach sometime. You don't never know. You don't know where that may go. Hospitality is important. A lot of good things have come out of hospitality. Sometimes you let somebody have a room in your house when they're in trouble in their life, and they're desperate almost. And so you share what you have with them. That's good to do that. That's good to do that. Bear one another's burdens. Use hospitality one to another. I gave you the wrong reference a while ago. That's in 1 Peter 5, in verse 9. But hospitality is to be used one with another and without grudging. Now, let's change the subject one more time here. I'm going to try to respect your clock back here. I want to think with you about Hebrews 10 and verse 24, where Paul, or whoever wrote Hebrews, said there that we are to provoke one another unto love and good works. Now, he didn't mean that we are to provoke one another into anger or something of that kind. It meant to stir up one another. We are to do everything we can to stir up each other, to do what's good, what's right. See, I need you to stir me up, and you need me to stir you up too. We owe each other something. Am I a brother's keeper? You bet. We are. And so we owe it to one another to do everything we can to stir each other up to love and good works. And it's in that context that the writer continues and said, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another. There's another one another. But exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Then he went on to sound a very ominous warning. He said, if we sin willfully after we've received the knowledge of the truth, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sin, but a certain fearful looking for of judgment and fiery indignation which shall devour the adversaries. Then he went on, he said, under the law of Moses, a man died, had capital punishment under the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. There's some 37 or 8 different offenses under the law of Moses that were capital offenses. And he said under the law, but it had to be done under the testimony of at least 2 or 3 witnesses. That was to prevent lynch mobs, things like that happen. But he said, of how much sorer or worse punishment, suppose ye, shall he be thought worthy who hath trodden under foot the Son of God, and hath counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing, and hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. Those are serious things to think about. And that's what he said about people who forsake the assembling of themselves together. And when they forsake that, they're not doing very much to provoke one another to love and good works. You know, in Colossians, the 3rd chapter, verse 16, Paul talked there about singing. And he said, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing, here it is, one another, in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. The ultimate object of our singing is to the Lord. Praise and honor him. But at the same time we're doing that, we teach and admonish one another. And how can we do that if we're not together? See, if we start abandoning the assembling of ourselves together, we find other things to do that we think are more important. And for trivial reasons, we absent ourselves from the gathering together of God's people. You can't provoke me if you're not here. I can't provoke you to love and good works if you're not here either. Works both ways. So, these are some of the one another passages in the New Testament. One more, I think I've got time to mention this one. In Ephesians, the 4th chapter, verses 28 and 9, Paul said, be kind one to another. Be kind one to another. We're living in a world now, topsy-turvy with controversy. Political world is eaten up alive with it. Sinister motives are imputed to opponents. Dirty tricks sometimes are played on political adversaries. What a travesty of justice that is. And so, we need kindness in the political world. We need kindness just in ordinary life. We need kindness at our houses, at our tables. Our children need to be kind to one another. Sometimes siblings fuss and quarrel and argue, and sometimes husbands and wives battle it out, and home becomes a battleground instead of a retreat where everybody can come and unburden themselves from the day and love one another and be together. So be kind one to another. You ever get in the wrong line at the store? If you ever see me in a line at the store, don't get behind me, because the line I'm in is not going to go very far. I'm good at it. I can get about finding the wrong line. You get all up to the checker almost, and the person right in front of you has got to have a price check on something they're buying. They got to call to the back of the store and get somebody to come up there and check this out, and there you stand. Or you're at the airport and your flight is delayed, and you know good and well if you don't leave pretty soon, you're going to miss your connecting flight when you get to Atlanta. And so the temptation is to take it out on whoever happens to be behind the counter, and they can't help it. Sometimes it's foggy, or there's other bad weather. They can't help that. It's not their fault. But we lose our tempers sometimes that way. We get to be impatient. You heard of road rage? Tell you, somebody cuts you off, don't you dare make eye contact with them. That could be dangerous. It could be deadly even. A preacher friend of mine, I heard his wife say, he was such a gentleman that he'd hold the door open for everybody at the grocery store and then try to run over every one of them in the parking lot. There's something about, I don't know what there is about it, but there's something about getting behind the wheel of an automobile that brings out the macho in some guys. And they take it out in traffic. They become, what kind of, shall we say, they become very aggressive drivers. That's the nicest way I know how to put it. Be kind one to another. I've been in business meetings where brethren sometimes forgot about that. They wouldn't be kind to each other. That's a shame. We need to treat each other with respect. Be kind one to another, forbearing one another. We got to put up with each other. We got to learn to live together. One another. So many passages that deal with that. And so we'll just leave it right there, where with being kind to one another. And I'm going to give you back 5 minutes, and I want to tell you, don't take that as an omen. I may not do that every time I speak today. But anyway, thank you for listening. You've been a wonderful audience already. I'm looking forward to preaching in a little while and again tonight. Thanks for being here. Would you consider what we've talked about?